There are fast cars. There are expensive cars. There are cars that win races, and cars that win awards, and cars that get written about in magazines. And then there is something else entirely. There are cars that get inside people. Cars that stop feeling like machines and start feeling like something alive. Cars that teenage boys tape to their bedroom walls not because they'll ever own one, but because the image alone does something to them. The Nissan Skyline is one of those cars. And here's what makes it strange. It wasn't the most powerful car of its era. It wasn't the most expensive. It wasn't born in Italy or Germany, the countries that built the mythology of the performance car. It was born in Japan, a country that, when the Skyline story begins, was still pulling itself out of the rubble of the worst war in human history.
And it was never even supposed to be sold in America. For years, most Americans had no legal way to buy one. They could only read about it, watch videos of it, play it in video games, and want it, badly, from a distance. Which, as it turned out, was exactly the kind of want that builds legends. Because the Skyline didn't become iconic through a marketing campaign. It didn't become iconic because some executive decided it would be. It became iconic the slow way, the real way. Through racing circuits in Australia, through mountain passes in Japan at 2 in the morning, through underground car culture that existed before the internet could amplify it, through the hands of engineers who cared more about lap times than sales figures, and eventually, through a movie franchise that brought the whole underground world above ground. This is the story of how a car becomes a myth. To understand the Skyline, you have to understand Japan in the 1950s. Not the Japan of Sony and Toyota and bullet trains. Not the Japan that would eventually become one of the most technologically advanced nations on Earth. The Japan of 1950 was a country in shock. The firebombing campaigns of 1944 and 1945 had destroyed large parts of Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and dozens of other cities. The atomic bombs had erased Hiroshima and Nagasaki in single moments. Millions were dead. Infrastructure was devastated. Industry had been dismantled or bombed into uselessness. The Japan that existed at the end of the war was a country that had to decide, very quickly, what it was going to become. And Japan made a decision that would shape everything that followed. It would rebuild, but it wouldn't rebuild the same way. It would rebuild smarter, more precisely, with a relentless obsession with quality that bordered on philosophical. The Americans brought a management consultant named W. Edwards Deming to Japan in the early 1950s to help rebuild Japanese industry. His ideas about quality control and continuous improvement were largely being ignored in America at the time. Japan embraced them completely. The concept was called Kaizen. Continuous improvement. Small refinements applied consistently, compounding over time into something extraordinary. It was not a dramatic philosophy. It didn't promise overnight transformation. It promised something harder and more durable. That if you improved something a little bit every single day and never stopped improving it, you would eventually build something the world had never seen. Japanese automakers applied this philosophy to their cars with an intensity that Western manufacturers seriously underestimated. Toyota, Honda, Mazda, Nissan. They weren't just building vehicles, they were proving a point. They were building machines that would eventually make the rest of the world stop and take notice. And none of them would make the world stop and stare quite like Nissan Skyline. The Skyline's origins are genuinely strange if you trace them back far enough. The nameplate didn't actually start with Nissan. It started with a company called Prince Motor Company.
Prince was one of several small Japanese automakers competing for a slice of Japan's recovering post-war market. In 1957, Prince released the first car to carry the Skyline name. And it was not, to put it generously, a threatening vehicle. It was a sensible, somewhat boxy sedan aimed at Japanese professionals, respectable people, people who needed reliable transportation to the office. Nothing about it suggested that its spiritual descendants would one day terrorize racing circuits on multiple continents. But underneath the conservative body, something was stirring. Prince's engineers had become fascinated with motorsport, not just as entertainment, but as engineering education. Racing, they understood, tells you things about a machine that normal use never reveals. It finds every weakness, every compromise, every place where an engineer made a decision based on cost rather than capability. And if you could build a car that survived racing, that actually excelled at racing, you had learned something about engineering that no amount of road testing could teach you. Prince began entering Skylines in Japanese racing events. The results were encouraging. And then, in 1964, something happened that would define the Skyline's character for the next 6 decades. Japan's most prestigious road race, the Japan Grand Prix at Suzuka, featured a class for touring cars. Prince entered a modified Skyline. Their opponent was a Porsche 904, a proper German performance car, a car from a company with a racing heritage stretching back decades, a car that should have had absolutely no difficulty defeating a Japanese sedan with a racing engine shoved into it. The Skyline kept pace. It didn't win, but it kept pace with a Porsche. In Japan, in 1964, that was an earthquake moment. The motorsport community sat up straighter. The automotive press paid attention. And inside Prince Motor Company, something shifted. The engineers who had built that Skyline understood something new about what they were capable of. Prince merged with Nissan in 1966, and Nissan, inheriting the Skyline and its racing program, made a decision that would prove to be one of the most consequential in Japanese automotive history. They kept it. They didn't dissolve the nameplate into a generic Nissan product. They kept the Skyline distinct. They kept the performance orientation. And in 1969, they released the first car to carry the letters that would eventually become legendary. GT-R, Gran Turismo Racing. The first-generation GT-R had a 2.0-liter inline-6 engine, producing around 160 horsepower. By today's standards, that sounds modest. But in 1969, in Japan, in a car that weighed what this car weighed and handled the way this car handled, it was formidable. It went racing almost immediately. And it almost immediately began winning. Between 1969 and 1972, the Skyline GT-R won 52 consecutive races in Japanese touring car competition. 52 in a row. No one could touch it. Other Japanese manufacturers tried. Nobody succeeded. The GT-R became, in a very short time, the most feared name in Japanese motorsport. And then, it disappeared. The oil crisis of 1973 hit Japan harder than almost anywhere else. Japan had no domestic oil supply. Everything came from overseas. When OPEC cut exports and prices quadrupled, the Japanese economy lurched violently. And the Japanese government responded by pushing automakers hard toward fuel efficiency. Powerful performance cars suddenly looked irresponsible, politically difficult, commercially risky. Nissan quietly shelved the GT-R name. The regular Skyline continued in various forms through the 1970s and 1980s. Nice enough cars, popular enough in Japan, but not special, not dangerous. The GT-R was gone. And here is one of the most important things to understand about how legends are built. The absence
made it bigger. Because the people who remembered the original GT-R didn't forget it. They talked about it. They built its mythology in the years of its absence with the kind of reverence that only grows when the thing you love is out of reach. The GT-R became, during the years it didn't exist, something it possibly couldn't have become if it had kept appearing in showrooms every year. It became mythological. A car that had been. A car that might come back. A car that people waiting for something worthy of their enthusiasm talked about with a longing that made it seem larger than it had ever actually been. When it returned, it would have to live up to an enormous amount of accumulated expectation. It did. The 1980s were Japan's decade. The economic miracle, which had been building since the 1960s, hit its full expression in the bubble economy of the late 1980s. Tokyo real estate became some of the most expensive on Earth. Japanese companies bought American landmarks. The Nikkei stock index climbed to heights that felt vertiginous even at the time. And the technology sector, which Japanese companies had been patiently building for decades, began producing things that genuinely astonished the world. Japanese automakers had the resources and the confidence to attempt something they hadn't attempted before. Not just competing with European performance cars, beating them. Honda released the NSX in 1990, a mid-engine supercar designed with the assistance of Ayrton Senna, priced to compete with Ferrari, and capable of doing so. Mazda unveiled the RX-7, Toyota built the Supra, Mitsubishi created the Lancer Evolution. This was Japan saying, collectively, to the performance car establishment of Europe, we're here now. And leading that charge, the car that would set the benchmark that others chased, was Nissan. With the return of the GT-R, the R32 Skyline GT-R arrived in 1989. And it arrived with a kind of thoroughness that made automotive journalists reach for superlatives they didn't normally use for Japanese cars. The engine was a hand-assembled, twin-turbocharged inline-six, the RB26DETT, 2 liters and 600 cubic centimeters, twin turbos, dual overhead cams, and an official power output of 276 horsepower. That last number is important, and a little dishonest. The Japanese automotive industry had agreed among themselves to cap official power figures at 276 horsepower, regardless of what the cars actually produced. It was a gentleman's agreement designed to prevent a horsepower war that might invite government regulation. The RB26 and the R32 almost certainly produced significantly more than 276 horsepower from the factory. Modified examples, which appeared almost immediately, were producing numbers that made European engineers uncomfortable. But the engine was only part of the story. The R32 GT-R was built around a system Nissan called Ateza, ETS, an electronically controlled all-wheel drive system that could vary torque distribution between front and rear wheels in fractions of a second. It also had Super Hikes, a 4-wheel steering system, and a chassis that had been developed with direct input from Nissan's racing division. Nissan didn't build the R32 and then decide to go racing. They built it for racing, from the very first design meeting. The road car was, in a sense, the racing car with seats and registration plates. The result was a machine that delivered cornering speeds and lap times that cars costing 3 and 4 times as much could not match. Australia saw it first. The R32 GT-R entered the Japanese Touring Car Championship, the Australian Touring Car Championship, and various other racing series almost simultaneously. In Australia, the local manufacturers had spent years building fast, competitive touring cars. Holden and Ford were serious operations, with serious engineering resources. They were not used to being beaten this comprehensively. The GT-R didn't just win in Australia. It won so consistently, with such an apparent lack of effort, that the local competitors became visibly frustrated. The Australian motoring press, trying to describe what they were watching, landed on a word: Godzilla. Godzilla was the giant monster that rose from the ocean and destroyed everything in its path. It was unstoppable. It was relentless. It didn't care about what you threw at it. Godzilla from Japan. The name spread instantly through the international automotive community. Within months, it was in European publications, American enthusiast magazines, online forums that were just beginning to emerge in the early days of the internet. Godzilla. And something about that name captured something true about the car. Because the R32 GT-R didn't beat its competitors through elegance or refinement. It beat them through sheer engineering-backed dominance. Through a technological advantage so significant that the competition needed regulations specifically designed to limit it, not performance, to have any chance. The GT-R was eventually banned from some Australian racing series, not because it cheated, because it was too good. Being banned for being too good is perhaps the greatest possible endorsement a performance car can receive, and the Skyline received it. Racing is important. Racing gives a car credibility that no advertisement can buy. You cannot fake lap times. You cannot fake a race win. Either the car is fast enough to beat the competition, or it isn't. The Skyline was, comprehensively. But racing alone doesn't make a car iconic in the way the Skyline became iconic. Racing creates respect among enthusiasts. What happened next created something larger. It created desire. Japan in the 1990s developed a car culture unlike anything that had existed before. The economic bubble burst in 1991, leaving a generation of young Japanese people with fewer career prospects than their parents had expected, but also with something else: time and access to extraordinary machines. Japan's highway system included elevated expressways that cut through the heart of Tokyo. The Shuto Expressway, the Wangan Line running along Tokyo Bay, the C1 Loop circling the city center. In the daytime, these were congested arteries clogged with trucks and commuters. Late at night, particularly in the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning, they transformed. Traffic thinned, visibility stretched, and young men in modified cars appeared. These weren't criminals in any meaningful sense. They weren't doing anything except driving very fast in places and at times when fast driving was theoretically possible without immediately endangering others. It was dangerous, genuinely dangerous, and illegal, genuinely illegal. But it was also something else. It was a genuine subculture with its own rules, its own heroes, its own aesthetic, its own language. The Wangan scene produced its own hierarchy. Fastest runs were tracked, compared, debated. Specific cars became famous not because their owners were wealthy, but because their machines were exceptional, modified beyond what the factory had imagined, tuned to produce numbers that factory engineers would have considered impossible. And at the top of that hierarchy, again and again, was the Skyline. The RB26 engine, it turned out, was not merely powerful in factory form. It was capable of absorbing modifications and additional power in quantities that most engines simply cannot sustain. The internal architecture was overbuilt, deliberately. The forged internals, the robust bottom end, the quality of the head gaskets and the valve train, all of it designed to handle more than the factory turbo setup provided. Tuners discovered this quickly. A few modifications, a larger turbo, upgraded fuel injectors, a piggyback computer, and suddenly, the GT-R was producing 400, 500, 600 horsepower from an engine that had been rated at 276. Cars capable of that kind of power, on a public highway, late at night, were doing things that most people had only seen at professional racing events. The stories spread, and they spread through a new medium that was just becoming powerful enough to carry them: the internet. Car culture found the early internet immediately. Forums appeared, dedicated to specific makes and models: JDM Underground, GT-R World, various Skyline-specific communities. Japanese enthusiasts and Western enthusiasts who had somehow gotten their hands on gray market imports found each other. Information flowed across borders that the cars themselves couldn't legally cross. Americans who couldn't buy a Skyline could read about them, could watch shaky video footage of R32s and R33s disappearing into Tokyo night, could pore over tuning specs and modification lists from enthusiasts who had actually driven them. The Skyline became, for a significant portion of the car community in the 1990s, the forbidden fruit. The car you couldn't have, the car the Japanese kept for themselves. And American import laws, the 25-year rule that prevents importing vehicles not federally certified for sale in the US, made it literally unavailable. You could own a Ferrari. You could own a Lamborghini. If you had the money, you could own almost any performance car on Earth. But you could not walk into a dealership and buy a Skyline GT-R. Not in America. Not legally. That inaccessibility did something to the car's reputation that no amount of availability could have achieved. It made people want it with a specific, slightly desperate intensity that only forbidden things generate. Then came the video games. Gran Turismo appeared on the original PlayStation in 1997. It was not the first driving game. It was not even the first realistic driving game. But it was the first driving game that treated cars the way enthusiasts treated them, with absolute seriousness, with obsessive attention to detail, with the understanding that the people playing this game didn't just want to race, they wanted to know. They wanted to understand the difference between a stock GT-R and one with upgraded turbos and a stiffer suspension setup. They wanted to feel, through a controller and a television screen, what made each car distinct. And Gran Turismo delivered. The Skyline GT-R appeared in that first game in multiple configurations: R32, R33, various tuned versions. Players could buy them, modify them, race them, could experience, in some approximation, what Japanese enthusiasts were experiencing on the Wangan. For millions of teenagers in America, Europe, Australia, and beyond, Gran Turismo was their first encounter with the Skyline. It was their introduction to a car they hadn't known existed. A car that, once encountered in that context, became something they researched obsessively, read about in magazines, sought out on the emerging car forums of the late 1990s internet. Gran Turismo handed the Skyline to a global generation and said, "This is the benchmark. This is what a performance car from Japan looks like at its best." And that generation believed it, because playing with the car, learning its handling characteristics, modding it through the game's upgrade system, built a relationship. A parasocial, fictional, screen-mediated relationship, but a real one in terms of what it did to how young people felt about the car. Need for Speed Underground arrived in 2003, Midnight Club, Tokyo Extreme Racer. Each game built the mythology a little further. Each game introduced the Skyline to another wave of enthusiasts who would spend the rest of their lives knowing, with certainty, that it was one of the great cars. And then, in 2001, something happened that brought everything above ground. The Fast and the Furious. The first film in the franchise was not a masterpiece of cinema, but it captured something real about streetcar culture, about the world that had been developing in Japan and America and elsewhere for years. The world of modified cars, underground racing, the specific subculture of people who spent their weekends and their disposable income turning ordinary machinery into something extraordinary. And in the second film, Too Fast, Too Furious, and then most famously in The Fast and the Furious, Tokyo Drift, the Skyline moved to center stage. Paul Walker's character drove an R34 GT-R, silver blue, with a sound that the film's sound designers spent considerable effort getting exactly right. That car, in that film, reached an audience measured in hundreds of millions. People who had never heard of the Skyline, people who had no interest in car culture, people who walked into the cinema expecting an action movie and walked out knowing exactly what an R34 GT-R looked like and sounding exactly like what it meant to the people who loved it. Posters appeared in bedroom windows across the world, desktop wallpapers, forum signatures. That specific car, in that specific color, with that specific body kit, became one of the most recognizable automotive images in the world. The underground had gone global, and the Skyline had gone with it. But here is the thing that all the films and video games and internet forums couldn't fully capture. The reason the Skyline created this reaction in the first place. The reason it deserved the mythology. The car itself. Driving a Skyline GT-R, especially an R32 or R33, is an experience that people who have done it remember with unusual clarity. It's not comfortable, particularly. It's not refined, in the way a German sports car pursues refinement. The steering is heavy. The ride is firm in a way that modern performance cars rarely are. The interior has the straightforward functionality of a car built by engineers who were thinking about weight and structural rigidity rather than ambient lighting. But when you drive it hard, when you begin to explore what it will actually do, something different happens. The car communicates. It talks to you through the steering wheel and the seat and the pedals in a language that modern cars, with their layers of electronic mediation, have largely forgotten how to speak. You feel the front end loading through a corner. You feel the all-wheel drive system working, distributing torque, adjusting, balancing. You feel when you're inside the limits and when you're approaching them. And the RB26, the sound of that engine under load is one of the sounds that enthusiasts describe with the kind of precision normally reserved for music. The specific tone of the twin turbos spooling, the exhaust note under hard acceleration, the intake sound at high revs. Drivers who have owned the car talk about these sounds the way musicians talk about the specific timbre of an instrument they've played for years. Personal, specific, irreplaceable. This is what the spec sheets and the forum posts and the video games couldn't give you. But it's what the car gave to everyone who experienced it directly. And they carried that experience back into the community, into the stories they told, into the reverence they brought to conversations about the car, which is how a machine builds the kind of reputation the Skyline built. Not through marketing, through honest experience, passed from person to person, across decades. The GT-R went through 3 generations in the modern era. R32, R33, R34. Each one refined the formula. Each one took what the previous had established and pushed further. The R33 is often the forgotten middle child, slightly heavier than the R32, more refined. Criticized at the time for being too civilized. History has been kinder to it. It was genuinely a better car in many measurable ways, even if the original's rawness was diluted slightly. The R34 is the one the world fell in love with on cinema screens, and it deserved the love. The R34 GT-R was perhaps the most complete expression of what Nissan's engineering team had been building toward since 1989. The RB26 in the R34 was still the core, still the same fundamental architecture, but refined, modified. The electronics had advanced, the chassis had evolved, the aerodynamics had been worked over. The R34 produced handling numbers that placed it in genuine supercar territory. A car that could lap the Nürburgring at times that embarrassed machines costing 3 times as much. And it was honest about what it was. The dashboard had a small screen displaying real-time telemetry data, engine temperatures, turbo boost pressure, G-force readings, not because drivers necessarily needed that information in daily driving, but because the car was built for people who wanted to know, who cared, who thought of driving as a serious activity deserving serious attention. The R34 was a car built for enthusiasts, by enthusiasts, and the world understood that about it. Nissan ended R34 production in 2002, and for a few years, the GT-R name went quiet again. A new GT-R eventually arrived in 2007, the R35, and it was extraordinary by any objective measure. Faster than almost anything at any price, with technology that placed it genuinely at the cutting edge of what production cars could do. But the community's reaction was complicated, because the R35 was different in character from everything that had come before. It was bigger, heavier, more insulated from the road, more digital, more contemporary. It was a supercar competing with other supercars, beating Ferraris and Porsches and Lamborghinis at the Nürburgring.
It was technically remarkable, but something about it felt different from the cars people had fallen in love with. The R35 was a car you respected. The R32, R33, R34 were cars you loved. There's a difference, and enthusiasts feel it even when they struggle to articulate it. The older cars had edges, imperfections, idiosyncrasies that made them feel alive in ways that thoroughly polished modern machines don't. This is not a criticism of modern engineering. Modern engineering is objectively superior. But there is something that gets lost in the pursuit of objective superiority. Something that the older Skylines had in abundance: personality. Today, a clean R34 GT-R commands prices that would have seemed delusional to anyone who encountered them 10 years ago. The depreciation that follows almost every car in the years after its production ends reversed completely for the R34, then reversed dramatically. Values climbed, then climbed faster. R34 GT-Rs in excellent condition now sell for prices that overlap with Ferraris and Porsches and other cars whose manufacturers would have considered the comparison offensive 30 years ago. The most exceptional examples have exceeded $500,000. For a Japanese mass-produced car from 1998 to 2002, the market, which is usually a fairly reliable guide to how much people actually want something, is saying something unambiguous about the Skyline. And what it's saying is this: the people who grew up dreaming about this car, who played it in Gran Turismo, who watched Paul Walker drive it on cinema screens, who read about it on forums when they were teenagers with no money and no possibility of ownership. Those people are adults now. Some of them have money, and they are buying the dream, at whatever price it takes. There is something larger happening with the Skyline's continued and growing relevance that's worth understanding. We are living through a moment of profound change in what cars are and what they do. Electric vehicles are not the future anymore. They are the present. And the cars being built now, the cars that will dominate roads in 20 years, are fundamentally different in character from everything that came before. They are smoother, quieter, more capable in objective terms. But the driving experience is different. The connection between driver and machine that mechanical cars provided, the feeling of an engine working, of turbos building boost, of exhaust notes rising and falling with the throttle.
All of that is disappearing. Not because anyone decided it should disappear, but because the future doesn't need it. The future is cleaner and more efficient and better for the planet and quieter and safer and in many measurable ways superior. And it sounds like nothing. And this is why the Skyline's legend keeps growing rather than fading, because it represents something that is genuinely being lost. Not just the car, an era. The era when mechanical complexity was the point, when you could hear what the car was doing, when the relationship between driver and machine was physical, visceral, honest, when the car shook slightly at idle, and the steering wheel pushed back against your hands, and the exhaust note told you something true about what the engine was doing at any given moment. The Skyline came from that era. It is one of the finest expressions of that era. And as that era recedes into memory, the machines that represented it most completely become more valuable, not less. This is not nostalgia. Nostalgia is passive. What enthusiasts feel about the Skyline is active. It's a response to genuine loss, a recognition that something specific and irreplaceable is disappearing. And the Skyline, more than almost any other car, represents what is being lost. The strange irony at the center of all of this is that Nissan never planned it. The engineers who built the R32 GT-R in 1989 were trying to win races. They were trying to prove that Japanese engineering had reached the level of European engineering. They were trying to do something specific and technical and measurable. They were not trying to create a cultural icon. They were not trying to make a car that teenagers in Ohio and teenagers in Germany and teenagers in Australia would tape to their walls and dream about. They were trying to win at Fuji Speedway. And they did. And the rest happened around them without any plan. Because that's how things become real. That's how something becomes genuinely iconic rather than marketed into the appearance of iconicity. Not through management decisions. Through driving a car hard enough that the people who watch it have no choice but to take it seriously. Through building something well enough that the tuners can take it further than the factory ever imagined. Through creating a machine that speaks so clearly to the people who love driving, that those people become its advocates and its historians and its guardians. The Skyline didn't need Nissan to build its legend after the fact. The legend built itself. From racing wins and tuner culture and video games and films and the word of mouth of every person who ever drove one and came back saying, "You have to understand, it's different. It's different from other cars. It does something other cars don't do. Something I'm not sure I can explain properly, but I need you to trust me. The car is different." And they were right. It was. It is. And whatever happens to the car industry next, whatever electric future arrives, that will remain true. The Skyline was one of the great ones, not because anyone declared it so, but because it earned it. The long way. The only way that actually counts. The only way that actually